Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have with us Leo Hoar. He is a UX research leader and founder of the UXR Institute. We explored with him a powerful fusion, how the principles of systematic user research, that is small, measured experiments, empathy, and evidence, can be applied to de risk not just product decisions, but the psychological challenges of entrepreneurship itself. Welcome to the show, Leo.
Thank you so much for having me, AJ.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, Leo. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll talk about entrepreneurship. We'll talk about de-risking the startup mind. And we'll talk about a lot about user experience. But before that, let's talk a bit about your journey, your background, so that the audience knows who they are listening to.
Absolutely, yeah. I started off on an academic path. I'm the child of two academics, and I witnessed my parents being very satisfied in that life, and so I thought I would follow in their footsteps. And for a time, I enjoyed the heck out of it. But I got bitten by the startup bug while working at Ohio State University in Ohio in the Midwest United States. There is a wonderful startup ecosystem there, and I started poking around and learning a bit about it. And before long, I realized they could use the skills of a person like me. That many startups do some form of research, and in order to understand the problem that they're solving or the need they're addressing, in order to understand the people that they're serving. And I thought, I can totally do that. And I sort of dived right in and started doing that work first, just as a consultant. As they say, I hung out a shingle and worked for some very small startups, a number of them just engineers who had an idea and started to build it. And doing that work, I realized, and I could see how much even just the most elementary research project with, to understand the competitive landscape or to understand exactly what users wanted or needed was so valuable to these companies. So I wanted to keep doing it. And that's what brought me to this point. I ended up working at a startup for over 6 years as their in-house researcher and built a team. And I could just continued to see the value of it as it scaled. So I'm very convinced of what that can do for startups at any stage, especially early on, because I like to think of it as like you're pointing a rocket, and if you just an adjustment of a few degrees at the very beginning means a huge change of direction down the line. So those early decisions matter so much. And really good, rigorous research can help get that aim just right.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree with you, Leo. But one thing that comes to my mind is, Leo, is that seeing the state of, customer experience, and if I can use the word user experience there, then should companies, especially startups, keep the user or the customer in mind when doing this research, or should they keep their own interest and entrepreneurship in mind when they are setting out for this user experience research?
That's a fantastic question. And that gets at the heart of many debates that have happened over the years. And even within this particular field, there's a bit of a push-pull in terms of, what is our mission and who are we accountable to? Some would say, well, we're accountable to the users and the people. We're representatives of the people, and the company has its own interest. And our goal is to sort of maybe push back against that. And sometimes that's true, but I don't think it's an either or. I think the way I would describe it is the work that we do finds the connection between those two things. So we find the connection between whatever whether you want to call them user needs, people will call them pain points, but sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes it's just you're doing something for people that hasn't been done before. It's not always about solving a problem. I don't know what problem ice cream solves, for example. You wouldn't say that it's like it solves hunger. It's more complicated than that. It delivers pleasure of some kind. So I like to step aside from that thinking of just problem solving. But anyway, you're finding that connection between the user or customer side and something that's beneficial to the business. That's really, in my opinion, that's what this work is all about. If you only take care of the user side, you're not going to produce anything of value to the business. And I think at the end of the day, we have to remember we work for the business. So we're not some form of external advocate. We work for the business. But I think in the ideal world, what you're finding is in finding that connection, you're helping people get their problem solved in a way that's sustainable for the business so that that solution can stick around for a long time. If you figure out this great solution, but the business can't survive doing it, what value is that at the end of the day? So it's about finding that balance. And I personally find that a lot of fun. I find there are disciplines like behavioral design, which has been really popular in the last 5 to 10 years, that really help rigorously map those two things onto one another. So figuring out what are the behaviors users are already doing or want to be doing, and where do those connect to what the business wants? I've found that really helpful in the past.
Absolutely, Leo. And before moving forward with the debate, let's understand it from this point of view. In this world, when things are changing so fast, customer needs are changing, customers' preferences are changing, and nobody wants to lose time. And that is where it comes to MVP, minimal viable product. When a lot of people emphasize on learning on the job, learning while making the product, let's launch the minimum viable product. How does user experience get into it? Does it come later, or does it never come, or does it still come when you are still launching the MVP product?
Oh, I think that's when you need it more than ever, because when you launch an MVP, you're taking a pretty big risk. And part of the reason that you're doing it is because you want to learn, right? You haven't yet invested the time, you may not have the resources to launch the perfect thing. But what you've realized, and I think the reason that idea, or that the reason that's almost everybody does that, is because you really don't learn very much from just sitting around the drawing board, so to speak. If you keep perfecting and perfecting, you're not going to learn as much doing that, just everything internally, as you would if you put it out in front of people and start to see, because there will be so many things you could never anticipate. So that's really the point at which it's most important. I would almost argue at this point, this might be a controversial statement, but all that research that gets done to optimize, usability testing, yeah, it's important, but it's not as crucial and critical as what you might be learning in that upfront stage. You might launch an MVP and yeah, you got a pretty decent reaction, but you notice something weird's going on. I think there's a tendency to try to rely on analytics to figure that out. I see this, I'm very active in Reddit threads on startups and UX research and all that. And I see very commonly, solopreneurs, founder engineers will build a thing, and they get an initial reaction and they're looking at the analytics to try to figure out, well, what's going wrong? I see a drop off, or I see I don't have the uptake that I did a month ago. And those are not questions that you're ever going to answer from analytics. You have to step outside of your bubble and go out there and figure out, what's going on. So yeah, I think that's a stage where research is most valuable. And again, I think that idea of putting something out there in order to learn is a great one, with one little caution. And I've learned that as I've launched my own operation. We call it the UXR Institute. The one thing I've learned is with services, especially, the idea of an MVP may not necessarily hold water. It kind of depends on the nature of the problem you're solving. If it's one of those what they call hair on fire problems, where it's like your hair's on fire, of course you'll take any solution. But if it's not one of those, if it's the kind of thing like a lot of forms of education are in some ways optional, you do have to be careful to put out to resist that temptation. I'll just put out anything, even if it's crappy, because you do have and in every case, you do have your brand reputation at stake. So you want to balance like how much will people understand and ignore the roughness of this product? Again, if it's a hair on fire kind of thing, the tendency will be fine. Thank God you got me a solution. But if it's not one of those, it could still be a successful business, but you just have to keep in mind that, you people may not accept an MVP version. You may need to put out something a little more elaborate. So that's always an important judgment call.
Absolutely, absolutely, Leo. So coming to the importance of the user experience research itself, is that which one is more important for an entrepreneur? Is it from the psychological point of view that it helps them understand exactly about their own challenges, or is it more about how much it will inform their business strategies? How should they look at it? Which one first?
I think it's about the latter, informing their business strategies, because doing user research is about understanding reality. And it's about stepping outside of your own preconceptions and, as much as possible, getting objective. Of course, that's very difficult to do completely or impossible, but that's really, in my opinion, that's so much of its value. And any good business strategy is built on reality, is built on what's actually happening out there in the world. So that to me is the primary value. But of course, doing that also has the psychological benefit, because when you're starting something, there are so many mind games going on. It's like, number one, you are very attached to your idea, and it's going to be very different. And I've now experienced firsthand. I understand. I get it. It's going to be very difficult to accept evidence that's different from what you think. But that is one of the most psychologically beneficial, and that's one of the things that's most beneficial to the business too, because letting in feedback and evaluating it critically is going to be absolutely essential at every stage going forward. And you see big famous examples of what happens when companies don't do that, even enormous ones like Meta. I think if anybody had asked out there in the world about the viability of the metaverse, they probably would have gotten a lot of answers that said, we don't know what this is for. We don't. But instead, it was one of these solutions that are solutions to a non-existent problem that the company was just internally convinced was going to work. And that's an example of like that confidence that gets built up in a bubble that isn't tested against reality. And so I think of course, they have plenty of money. They can afford to waste $180 billion or whatever it was. But small early stage startups or startups of one can't afford to waste $200. So that sort of process of testing and figuring out, is this going to work? It's essential, in my opinion, to the viability of the business at that really kind of crucial early stage.
Absolutely. But you talk about, a need to study your customers systematically, not just through casual conversations. How do you do that? Because it's a startup, they have little resources, still haven't got funding. And you talk about also that customer surveys are poorly done even by fund companies. So those things do not work. So let's come to the systematic customer study?
That's a fantastic question. I think one that the answer hopefully will be really useful to people. I could start off by talking about what's not systematic. So what's not systematic is talking to whoever's closest to you, um, having just an informal conversation where you're kind of guided by whatever questions come to mind. Um, uh, so those are kind of two important points. And in my experience, that can be a tendency at that early stage is to kind of like just rely on people close to you. Um, and also, even when folks will go sort of outside more broadly, they may not be thinking about, okay, am I speaking to people who are representative of the audience I intend to serve? It's kind of like a scattershot effort. So to talk about what is systematic, I think it's helpful to refer to the research practices that academics use or that industry research uses when there's a lot at stake. So in the policy world or in medicine, um, qualitative research, just to take one example, there's a lot of deliberateness around the sample of people that you're speaking to. Um, Now, there is something called convenience sampling. So that is where you do talk to people closest to you. But in my opinion, that can be okay in certain academic contexts. But in a startup context, that can be fatal because the people closest to you might be the ones who say, yes, sure, okay, this sounds great. They don't want to hurt your feelings. You have to step outside into that zone of people who they don't really know you, they don't care, and they're more likely to be honest. So that's one big element of being systematic is finding people who are representative of the audience you think you're serving. And may they be people who you have no connection with, and they have no reason to tell you or to be dishonest, just to be nice. Now, people, of course, we're all human beings, will still be that way, but that maybe leads into another element of systematic, which is the types of questions you're asking. So now, assuming you have a good sample of people who, again, representative of the audience you think you're serving, are you asking questions the right way? Or are you using the right method that will get the right kind of feedback? So sometimes just asking questions can be difficult. If you ask somebody, do you like this? Would you use this? Opinions are not that valuable at this point. And also projections of future behavior. Human beings are terrible at that. We think, of course, we're going to be going to the gym in the new year. I did. We're terrible at that. And between that, we're bad at predicting, we idealize the future, and also we want to be nice. Of course, we'll tell you we'll use this thing. So it's a matter of, can I get my questions right so that I'm not asking for opinions, but that I'm investigating, I'm gathering more objective factual information that would help me. An example of that is, rather than focusing on my product, let me learn about the problem or the situation that I'm going to be addressing for you. Let me ask you questions about that. If I'm building a company to provide education to researchers or designers or PMs, instead of going to them and saying, do you want this? Let me understand what challenges they face. What are the things that you don't know that make it difficult to do your job? Or, give me an example of a struggle you've faced learning some new skill or something like that. So investigate the situation rather than just fixating on your product. That's a way to, again, be much more systematic because you're learning, the shorthand for me is you're learning about reality rather than just learning about life inside the bubble of your own product. So those two things, I think, if people just observe those, again, a representative sample, and then focusing on the problem space, the situation that users are in, rather than just preferences and opinions, just doing those two things alone, I think, are very big steps in the way of being systematic. Maybe the third is what you do after you've had those conversations. And this is often something that's skipped because people absorb what they want to absorb and cast off the rest. So even if you observe steps 1 and 2, you might still come away, you might decide to keep the conclusions that serve you and throw away the ones that don't. So I think documenting what you've learned and being really objective and honest about, okay, this is truly what these conversations say. We would call that analysis or qualitative analysis. But for civilians or founders, it's just a matter of maybe recording the interview and going back and really pulling out and being honest about the conclusions. And that involves a certain amount of what we call reflexivity, which is while doing that, be honest with yourself. What are you attached to? What might you be seeing that might not be there? And that can just be a process of reflecting and writing, talking to other people. And maybe that's the final thing I would say. So 4, you're talking to a former academic. Of course, you're going to get a lecture. But anyway, the 4th thing is involve other people in this process. One person doing research is not systematic because that one person, especially if they're a founder attached to their idea, is going to want to see the world in a certain way really badly. So bringing in another perspective, especially somebody who is not as attached as you, is an incredibly valuable move because they can say, well, I sat in on that interview too, but I didn't hear what you're hearing. And in that debate, it may not be one is right, one is wrong, but it's somewhere in the middle. And getting to the middle will be a lot more valuable than just being trapped in your own world as a founder. So that would be my concluding thing. To involve other people is an easy way to be more systematic because you're just putting in another perspective that's not your own.
Absolutely, Leo. Then who evaluates? Who is the right person to evaluate your data? Because you talk about the surveys, which is useless data. Why is that useless? And why will this become, fruitful?
I mean, surveys can be useful, but the problem is surveys are incredibly complicated instruments that take a lot of expertise to do well. But unfortunately, there are tools out there that make them look very accessible. But I would say a survey is a lot like a musical instrument. Like you can take a cello. It looks simple enough. It has 4 strings, but you're not going to make music from it until you've had some training. And I think surveys are the exact same thing. So a lot of the like plug and play surveys, satisfaction surveys and all that will only get you so far. There is a very famous question. I can't remember who developed it, but it's a question you ask at an early stage after your product launch. And it's basically asking people how disappointed they would be if they couldn't have the product anymore. And a lot of people in a lot of books put a lot of weight on this question. And that's helpful for sure. But I think doing surveys can be valuable at the earlier stage if what you're doing is learning more about your audience at scale. But again, that takes a lot. It would really take an expert to do it well. I think surveys are the most likely research instrument to mislead people, because if you don't know what you're doing, you might see some conclusions in a survey that are just, you might read a bar chart and draw a conclusion from it and say, okay, we've got our direction. When if you didn't get your sample right, that conclusion may be built on a foundation of sand. So that's why I say surveys are definitely, they can be pretty shaky especially for founders, because if you're just writing up a survey in Google Forms and sending it out, there's no guarantee that whatever conclusions you're drawing from it, just from looking at it, are going to be valid. So yeah,
absolutely.
I would attach a warning label to surveys when it comes to founders for that reason.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of these startup founders, they are young people, have that feeling, have a great passion, conviction on their idea. Already they have thought 20 ideas and filtered to one or two. And then they have worked on that and gone out to gather all the information, the right kind of customers to understand it. And they also know stories where nobody had conviction in their ideas and those ideas succeeded and are $1 million, $1 billion companies. And they also get inspired by such ideas. And when they go to the market, the results show you are not ready to launch. And they ask, am I ready to launch? Who guides? Is it your conviction that will guide you or that should guide you? Or is it that small sample size before your launch that should guide you? How would you want them to evaluate this part of the state of affairs at that point in time?
So in other words, to what degree is it just like your own intuition or conviction
Right.
versus being guided by? Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question, and I think people would answer that very differently depending on who you talk to. I actually saw a great interview with Jeff Bezos at some point in the last year, that talked about the importance of intuition. I think it was Jeff Bezos, but you'd want to think of somebody who founded a company like that as being 100% analytical all the time. But I don't think that really great founders are 100% analytical all the time. I listened to cite another source. I listened to a book recently by the marketing guru Rory Sutherland. The book is titled Alchemy, and the basic idea behind it is kind of that the business ideas that have succeeded, they succeed in the same way that certain traits that are valued by the evolution process end up being successful. Nobody saw it coming. Certain ideas, they weren't planned to be successful. There's a certain element of spontaneity with some of these things. If you watch the movie The Social Network about the founding of Facebook, and if it's an accurate portrayal, Mark Zuckerberg didn't sit down at his computer in his Harvard dorm room and plot to take over the world and imagine that 20 years later it would be the company that it is. He was doing something for college students, is more or less spontaneously. And so I think, to answer your question finally, intuition is an important part of it. But I think, just like all of my answers, I tend to answer it's a little bit of both. Because if you take the example of early Facebook, that idea might have been created out of intuition, but as soon as it was introduced to the world, it took off like wildfire. So you do really, at the end of the day, need both. But I would say maybe my concluding point in answer to your question is I would never want to underestimate the importance of intuition, because it's that knowledge, that latent knowledge that people have accumulated from potentially a lifetime, even if that lifetime is short, that maybe they can't articulate, but it's crystallized in this idea. And I would just say that there is value in that. And that, especially you made a reference to youth. Youth is the time to follow intuition. And even if it leads to something that doesn't work out, to at least follow it and see where it leads and have it be corrected by reality, by learning. But, I would say I personally, well, my astrological sign is Pisces, so of course a Pisces would say this, but I personally see a lot of value in not ignoring that intuition. Again, of course, you want it to be tested, you want it to be evaluated against evidence. But even as a researcher who you'd think would say all of this should have evidence from users, I don't think it's an either or. I think there is still value in those intuitions or those convictions that founders can have. And I would never I would never counsel somebody to ignore them.
Absolutely. One last question that I want to understand from you, Leo, for the audience, and especially for entrepreneurs, is that, uh, is the importance of this particular, essence, which will not be part of the product that you are about to launch. And that is the perception. And perception not about the product, but about the people, about the company that you are creating. A lot of young generation want to deal with not only the good product but also with good people, especially the new generation. They are choosing products, even lesser products, but perhaps with better people, better persons. The same product perhaps outside Meta will be different, and when it enters the Meta rooms, people's perception will be different. Hope I, so that's the same thing I mean. I mean, how do you look at that part in your product, which is still not launched, but will be one of the big things in the coming days as soon as it is launched and moves forward? How does that work in today's time?
Hmm. I mean, it sounds like you've really done your homework on understanding how people think. Um, that makes a lot of sense. I remember reading something years ago about how the internet, the future of the internet, was actually going to turn and become more local. In other words, that it's almost like people don't want more anonymity and more scale and expansion. They want less. So maybe that's you're pointing to a version of that where it's I actually want to know the people behind this, and I want to trust them and like them. And maybe that's exacerbated more by all the products of AI, where it becomes more and more difficult to tell what's truth and what's simulation. But to answer your question, I mean, I think it depends on the business. I've found personally in what I'm trying to do that um, establishing credibility is one of the most important things.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Can such a thing be injected into your customer interaction at before the launch of the product itself?
Yes. Sorry, that's a very specific question. I would say absolutely, and I would say that the way that I've seen early stage founders behave on social media is in a way that's really authentic. I can think of one founder I know who's got an AI enabled product, and his presence on social media is extremely number one, he's extremely active as himself. He's not just hiding behind the company page. So I think that interacting as yourself as a founder and finding your unique voice is the way that a lot of founders do. I think what you're describing, video is becoming absolutely essential for the launch of anything. And what you see more and more of these days is the exact kind of format you see here, the talking head kind of format, where it's pretty intimate. It's not a marketing video. It's a video where you're getting to know the person behind the product. So I think obviously it's a judgment call depending on the nature of your product. But I would give one example. In this country, there is an entrepreneur whose company is based in this area outside Washington, D.C. He's very famous. His name is Palmer Luckey. He was the founder of Oculus, which got acquired by Facebook, and now runs a defense contracting company called Anduril. You would think a defense company, I can't name the CEO of Boeing or Lockheed Martin or any of these other companies. I have no idea. I know this guy in part because he wears Hawaiian shirts. That's his thing. But he has always been the face of his company. And you can't help but wonder, to what degree is that deliberate cultivation of a human identity, you can't help but wonder, is that part of what propels the company's success, as opposed to the more faceless defense contractors out there that hide behind their glass windowed buildings and you don't really know too much about them personally. So I throw that out there as an example. I think your question points to something very important, that there is definitely an increasing desire for that authenticity. Practically speaking, video is kind of the way that people are, I think, doing that in large part. But there are probably other ways that I'm not aware of, because I'm old.
There is so much to learn about all this from you, Leo, and I'm sure a lot of businesses and entrepreneurs would across the globe would want to learn more from you, about you, all these things. Perhaps uh, learn, be your client. What's the best way for them to do so?
We are at uxrinstitute.com. You can find us on the site. We have 5 or 6 forms you can fill out to get in contact with us. I answer my own emails, of course, and probably will be for a very long time. But I'm Leo at uxrinstitute.com. I would love messages from anybody who's interested in this kind of work. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much, AJ. This was a blast.